The flight line was alive with activity despite the early hour. Maintenance crews made final checks on her A-10. Weapons specialists armed the hardpoints with deadly precision. Fuel trucks topped off tanks that would carry her deep into enemy territory and hopefully back home again. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with her clipboard and the kind of maternal authority that made colonels nervous. "She's ready for you, Captain. Fully mission capable, all systems green." Viper performed her walk-around inspection with the thoroughness of someone whose life depended on every rivet and wire. The A-10 was a masterpiece of functional brutality. Twin engines mounted high to avoid ground fire, titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit, redundant flight controls that could bring her home even with massive battle damage. Not beautiful, but beautiful in the way that effective tools were beautiful. Ordnance load. 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, full combat load of 30mm high-explosive incendiary ammunition, and external fuel tanks for extended range. Rodriguez consulted her checklist with professional pride. "Everything you requested, Captain. Bring her home in one piece." "That's the plan, Chief." The lie came easily, automatically. They both knew the statistics for solo penetration missions into heavily defended airspace. They both knew that bringing her home was secondary to mission completion. But some truths were too dark for pre-dawn conversations between professionals who genuinely cared about each other. Major Reynolds appeared out of the morning gloom, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "Final weather update," he said, handing her the blessed caffeine. "Storm fronts moving faster than predicted. You'll have cloud cover by 0600, but visibility will degrade rapidly after that." "How rapidly?" "Best guess, 2 hours of marginal conditions before it becomes genuinely dangerous to fly." He paused, studying her face in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "That's not much time, Viper." "It's enough." The confidence in her voice surprised them both. "I'll be in and out before the weather becomes a factor." They both knew she was whistling past the graveyard, but optimism was part of the warrior's toolkit. Doubt was a luxury that got people killed, so they wrapped themselves in certainty like armor and pretended the odds were better than they were. Radio call signs for today. "You'll be Viper 1. AWACS will be looking for you on button 4, call sign Watchdog. Search and rescue is standing by on guard frequency if things go sideways." Reynolds handed her a small card with frequencies and codes. "Emergency authentication is Tombstone 77. The authentication code sent chills down her spine. Tombstone. Someone in operations had either a sense of irony or a serious case of gallows humor. She tucked the card into her flight suit pocket and tried not to think about omens. The eastern horizon was beginning to light. The morning briefing room at Kandahar Air Base fell silent when Admiral Thorne's voice crackled through the secure video link. His weathered face filled the screen, gray eyes scanning the assembled pilots like a hawk evaluating prey. "Gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you stays in this room." The word gentleman hung in the air like cordite after a gunshot, deliberately excluding the one person who shouldn't have been there. Captain Reina Viper Castellanos sat in the back row, her flight suit crisp despite the 120-degree Afghan heat. 28 years old, 5'4" of pure determination wrapped in Kevlar and attitude. The other pilots had stopped snickering about her call sign months ago, after she'd put her Thunderbolt II through maneuvers that defied physics and common sense. But Admiral Thorne had never seen her fly. "Intelligence indicates a high-value target has fortified himself in the Korangal Valley," Thorne continued, his Boston accent cutting through the static. "The terrain is a nightmare. Sheer cliffs, narrow passages, surface-to-air missile sites every 50 meters. We've lost 2 Apache gunships and an F-16 trying to penetrate that airspace." The room grew colder despite the desert sun beating down on the corrugated steel roof. "No aircraft can survive what they've got waiting up there." Viper's fingers traced the worn leather of her flight gloves. She'd heard whispers about Koringal, the Valley of Death, they called it, where aircraft went to die and pilots became statistics. Her grandfather's Mustang had crashed in similar mountains during World War II. He'd walked out 3 days later with a purple heart and stories that made her 8-year-old self dream of wings and altitude. The target is Khalil Hassan. Thorne's voice dropped to a whisper. He's been coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. Every roadside bomb, every suicide vest, every dead American soldier traces back to his network. The Admiral's jaw tightened. We're going to smoke him out with a ground assault. Ranger teams will establish overwatch positions while... Sir, Viper's voice cut through the briefing like a blade. Every head turned. Major Reynolds, the squadron leader, shot her a look that could melt titanium. Admiral Thorne's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. Did someone just interrupt me? His tone could have frozen jet fuel. Viper stood, her boots clicking against the concrete floor. In the silence, she could hear the distant whine of turbines as another mission launched into the crystalline Afghan sky. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. Permission to speak freely, Admiral. The room held its breath. Outside, a dust devil spiraled across the tarmac, scattering debris like a brown tornado. Thorne leaned forward, his face filling the screen until she could count the scars on his chin. Granted. Viper's grandfather had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite the terror clawing at your throat like a wild animal. She could feel that terror now, cold and sharp, but she pushed through it like breaking the sound barrier. The A-10 can penetrate that airspace, sir. Low and slow terrain masking, radar signature smaller than a motorcycle. Give me a chance. The silence stretched like piano wire. Major Reynolds' face had gone purple. Captain Morrison, sitting 2 rows up, shook his head slowly. They all knew what happened to pilots who volunteered for suicide missions. They also knew what happened to careers when you contradicted an admiral on a live video feed. Thorne's laugh was like gravel in a cement mixer. Captain, I've been flying combat missions since before you were born. I've seen the wreckage of every aircraft type in our inventory scattered across mountainsides from here to Kosovo. The A-10 is tough, I'll give you that, but it's not invincible. No, sir, it's not invincible. Viper's voice gained strength. But it's survivable. The Warthog was built to take hits and keep flying. Titanium bathtub around the cockpit, redundant flight controls, engines mounted high to avoid ground fire. And sir, with respect, I know those mountains. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a crashed bird. Viper had never talked about her previous deployment, about the night she'd nursed a dying A-10 through those same peaks with one engine gone and hydraulics leaking like tears, about the Taliban fighter who'd put an RPG through her left wing and lived to regret it for exactly 30 seconds. Admiral Thorne studied her through the pixelated video connection. She could see him calculating odds, weighing politics against practicality, measuring her resolve against the body count that failure would bring. The air conditioning unit in the corner coughed and wheezed, struggling against the heat like everything else in this godforsaken theater. What's your call sign, Captain? Viper, sir. And how did you earn that handle? The question landed like a punch to the gut. Most call signs came from mistakes, embarrassing moments, or physical characteristics. Hers came from something darker. I prefer not to say, Admiral. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He'd been around long enough to recognize the weight of unspoken ghosts. Major Reynolds, what's your assessment of Captain Castellano's capabilities? Reynolds cleared his throat, trapped between honesty and politics. She's unconventional, sir, aggressive, some might say reckless. He paused, choosing his words like picking through a minefield. But she's also the best close air support pilot I've ever seen. When the Rangers are in trouble, they ask for Viper by name. The compliment felt like a bandage on a sucking chest wound, appreciated but insufficient. Viper had heard the whispers in the chow hall, seen the sideways glances in the briefing room. Female pilots were still a curiosity in the A-10 community, viewed with mixture of skepticism and protective condescension that made her teeth grind. Admiral Thorne drummed his fingers against his desk, 3,000 miles away in the Pentagon's climate-controlled comfort. Each tap echoed through the speakers like a countdown timer. The intel suggests Hassan has Russian-made SA-15 Gauntlet systems. Those missiles will swat you out of the sky before you know you're painted. Not if I stay in the weeds, sir. NOE flight profile, following the river valleys, pop up only for target identification. Viper could visualize the route in her mind like a three-dimensional chess game. Years of studying topographic maps had burned those mountain contours into her memory. The gauntlets need clear line of sight. Give me weather cover and I can ghost through their engagement envelope. The Admiral's aide whispered something off-camera. Thorne nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Outside the briefing room, a C-130 rumbled down the runway, its 4 turboprops beating the air into submission. The sound reminded Viper of her father's crop duster back in New Mexico, the way it would struggle to clear the power lines on hot summer mornings. Captain Castellanos, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Thorne leaned forward until his face filled the entire screen. Are you volunteering for this mission because you think you can succeed, or because you have something to prove? The question hit like a sidewinder to the cockpit. Viper felt her cheeks burn, felt the eyes of every pilot in the room boring into her skull. The honest answer was complicated, a tangle of grief, anger, and professional pride that she couldn't untangle even for herself. But honesty was a luxury she couldn't afford. Both, sir. The admission surprised everyone, including herself. Admiral Thorne's eyebrows climbed higher, disappearing under the brim of his combination cover. Major Reynolds made a sound like a pressure valve releasing. The younger pilots shifted in their seats, suddenly understanding they were witnessing something raw and real. At least you're honest. Thorne's voice carried a note of grudging respect. But honesty doesn't stop surface-to-air missiles, Captain. Neither does bravado. No, sir, it doesn't, but skill does, and luck, and sometimes pure stubborn refusal to die. Viper's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I've been shot down before, Admiral, in these same mountains. I walked out because my aircraft held together long enough to get me to survivable terrain. The A-10 brought me home when everything else failed. The silence that followed was different, heavier, pregnant with possibility. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Through the briefing room's small window, Viper could see her Warthog parked on the flight line, its gray paint scarred by combat and weather, nose art depicting a coiled desert viper with fangs bared. Admiral Thorne finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. Major Reynolds prepped Captain Castellanos for a detailed intelligence briefing. I want her to know everything: terrain, weather, enemy positions, escape routes, extraction protocols. He paused, studying Viper's face through the digital connection. Captain, you'll have one shot at this. Miss your window, and Hassan disappears into the Pakistan tribal areas where we can't touch him. Understood, sir. One more thing. The Admiral's tone hardened. This conversation never happened. Officially, I'm authorizing a routine reconnaissance mission over the Korangal Valley. What happens after you cross into that airspace is between you, God, and the Taliban. The screen went black with an electronic snap that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Major Reynolds slowly closed his laptop, the soft click echoing like a rifle bolt sliding home. The other pilots began filing out, their conversations muted and respectful. They understood they'd witnessed something significant, not just military planning, but a moment when careers hung in the balance and lives were wagered against impossible odds. Viper remained seated, staring at the blank wall where Admiral Thorne's face had been. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline finally finding an outlet after months of frustration. She'd spent her entire career fighting two wars, one against America's enemies, another against the perception that she didn't belong in a cockpit. Viper, Major Reynolds' voice was surprisingly gentle. You sure about this? She turned to face him, seeing past the gruff exterior to the genuine concern underneath. Reynolds had two daughters back in Colorado, both younger than her. She wondered if that colored his protective instincts. Mike, you know what they called me before Viper? He shook his head. Princess, because apparently being 5'4" and female automatically makes you delicate. Her laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. Then I put a Maverick missile through a Taliban command bunker from 8 miles out in a sandstorm, and suddenly I wasn't so delicate anymore. Reynolds nodded slowly. He'd heard the stories, seen the gun camera footage that had circulated through pilot training schools like underground currency. Viper's precision under fire had become legend, the kind of flying that made old-timers shake their heads and mutter about kids these days being either very good or very lucky. The brass still calls it luck, she continued, standing and smoothing down her flight suit. They don't understand that luck is just preparation meeting opportunity. I've been preparing for this my whole life, Mike. Every training flight, every combat mission, every night spent studying terrain maps and weather patterns. Through the window, maintenance crews were already prepping her A-10, checking weapons pylons and topping off fuel tanks. The sight filled her with familiar comfort, the mechanical ballet of professionals preparing for war, each movement precise and purposeful. What aren't you telling me about that crash? Reynolds asked quietly. The question stopped her cold. She'd never spoken about that night, not to the accident investigators, not to the flight surgeons, not even to herself in the small hours when sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't mechanical failure, she said finally. My wingman got disoriented in the weather, flew straight into a ridge line. I tried to save him, followed him down into terrain that should have killed us both. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He didn't make it out. Reynolds absorbed this information like a stone thrown into deep water, the immediate impact followed by spreading ripples of understanding. Survivor's guilt was common among combat pilots, but this felt different, more personal. What was his name? Marcus Rivera, call sign Eagle, best pilot I ever flew with. Viper's hands clenched into fists. He had a wife back in San Antonio, twin boys he'd never seen because we deployed 2 weeks after they were born. The weight of that loss settled between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Reynolds had seen too many good people die in this endless war, watched too many flag-draped coffins disappear into cargo holds bound for Dover Air Force Base. But he'd never seen someone carry death like Viper did, not as trauma, but as fuel. Is that why you want this mission? To balance the scales? I want this mission because I'm the only pilot who can complete it and come home alive. Her voice regained its strength, steel returning to replace the momentary vulnerability. Hassan's killed hundreds of American soldiers, Mike. How many more wives become widows while we sit here playing it safe? Outside, the afternoon call to prayer echoed across the base from the local villages, a haunting melody that reminded everyone they were strangers in a strange land. Viper had learned to find peace in that sound, a reminder that even in war zones, people still reach toward something larger than themselves. Intelligence briefing in 30 minutes, Reynolds said, standing and gathering his papers. Weather, terrain, target details, emergency protocols. After that, you're committed. I've been committed since the day Marcus died. He paused at the door, looking back at her small figure silhouetted against the window. For what it's worth, I think you can pull this off. But Viper, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. What are the right reasons? Reynolds smiled sadly. That's something every warrior has to figure out for themselves. Alone in the briefing room, Viper pressed her palm against the warm glass and stared at her aircraft. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, was an ugly bird by any aesthetic measure. Stubby wings, ungainly proportions, engines mounted like afterthoughts. But beauty was irrelevant when your life depended on bringing the maximum amount of ordnance to bear with surgical precision. Her grandfather's voice echoed across the decades. Mija, an airplane is just metal and wires until someone with courage climbs into the cockpit. Then it becomes something more, a weapon, a shield, a way home. She closed her eyes and began mentally rehearsing the mission profile, visualizing every terrain feature, every potential threat, every decision point that might mean the difference between victory and becoming another casualty statistic in an already bloody war. The intelligence briefing room smelled of burnt coffee and old cigarettes, despite the no-smoking regulations that had been in effect since before Viper was born. Captain Jessica Torch Nakamura, the squadron intelligence officer, had spread aerial photographs across the scratched metal table like tarot cards predicting doom. Each black and white image revealed another layer of Hassan's fortress in the Korangal Valley: anti-aircraft emplacements, hardened bunkers, radar installations that could track a sparrow at 20 miles. The target area is here. Torch pointed to a cluster of buildings carved into the mountainside like an eagle's nest. Elevation 8,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that reach over 12,000, natural choke points at every approach vector. Viper studied the photographs with the intensity of a jeweler examining diamonds. Her eyes traced potential flight paths, calculated angles of attack, memorized every ridge and valley that might provide cover. The terrain was familiar, not identical to where Marcus had died, but similar enough to trigger memories she'd rather forget. How current is this imagery? 72 hours. We've had a Predator drone conducting overwatch, but Hassan's people are smart enough to stay underground during daylight hours. Torch flipped to the next photograph, this one showing heat signatures captured by infrared sensors. This is what we see at night: elevated thermal readings from multiple locations, indicating significant personnel concentrations. Surface-to-air missile sites. 3 confirmed SA-15 batteries, positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the entire valley. Torch's expression was grim. Plus shoulder-fired weapons, heavy machine guns, and at least one Zu-23 twin-barrel anti-aircraft gun salvaged from Soviet wreckage. The numbers painted a picture that would give any sane pilot nightmares. Viper absorbed each detail methodically, building a three-dimensional mental model of the battle space. Her grandfather had taught her that knowledge was the only armor that mattered. You could survive being outgunned, but ignorance would kill you faster than any enemy. Weather forecast. Partially cloudy, visibility 7 miles, winds from the southwest at 15 knots, but there's a storm system moving in from the Pakistan border. By evening, we're looking at heavy cloud cover and possible precipitation. That's good, Viper murmured, earning confused looks from everyone else in the room. Weather degrades their radar coverage and visual acquisition. I can use the cloud deck for concealment. Major Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It also degrades your navigation and target identification capabilities. Flying NOE in mountainous terrain during marginal weather is extremely hazardous. So is getting shot down by surface-to-air missiles. Viper's tone remained calm, professional. I'll take meteorological risks over human ones any day. Torch continued the briefing, detailing Hassan's background, his network of contacts, his methods of operation. The picture that emerged was of a man who understood warfare as both art and science, someone who'd studied American tactics and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize superior technology with superior positioning. He's been in these mountains for 6 years, Torch explained. Knows every cave, every trail, every sight line. Local population supports him either through ideology or intimidation. This isn't just a military target, it's the heart of insurgent operations for 3 provinces. The weight of that responsibility settled on Viper's shoulders like a lead blanket. One successful mission could save hundreds of American lives, disrupt enemy operations across the entire region. One failure would hand Hassan a propaganda victory worth more than a dozen suicide bombings. "Time on target?" she asked. "First light tomorrow, 05:30 local." Reynolds consulted his watch. "That gives you 14 hours to prep your aircraft, file a flight plan, and get some rest." "I don't need rest. I need ordnance load specifications and updated weather." "Viper, when's the last time you slept?" Torch's voice carried maternal concern that seemed incongruous in the sterile briefing room. The question hit harder than intended. Sleep had become elusive lately, filled with dreams of burning aircraft and voices calling from the darkness. Marcus's voice, mostly, asking why she'd lived when he hadn't. "I'll sleep when Hassan's dead." That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Reynolds closed the intelligence folder with decisive finality. 4 hours mandatory crew rest. Doctor's orders and squadron commander's direct command. You're no good to anyone if you're flying on fumes and adrenaline. Viper wanted to argue, but recognized the wisdom in his words. Fatigue killed pilots more efficiently than enemy fire, degrading judgment and reaction times until small mistakes became catastrophic failures. She'd seen too many good people die because they thought willpower could substitute for proper rest. "Fair enough, but I want weapons specialists to configure my loadout tonight. Maverick missiles, 30mm cannon with high-explosive incendiary rounds, and external fuel tanks for extended range." "Already arranged." Reynolds smiled grimly. "Your bird will be armed and ready by 0400. All you have to do is climb in and fly." The dismissal was gentle but firm. Viper gathered her flight gear and headed for the door, but Torch's voice stopped her. "Captain Castellanos, why do they call you Viper?" The question hung in the air like cordite after a gunshot. Everyone knew better than to ask about call signs directly. They were earned through trial, often embarrassing trial. But something in Torch's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than idle gossip. Viper turned back, studying the intelligence officer's earnest face. Japanese-American, probably second generation, with the kind of precise attention to detail that made excellent analysts and terrible poker players. Someone who believed information was power and secrets were weaknesses to be exploited. "You really want to know?" "Only if you want to share." The honesty in that response was surprising. Most people asked out of morbid curiosity or social obligation, not because they genuinely cared about the answer. Viper found herself actually considering it, weighing the therapeutic value of confession against the strategic advantage of mystery. "During my first deployment, we were providing close air support for a special forces team that got pinned down by sniper fire. Couldn't locate the shooter, couldn't call in artillery without risking friendly casualties." She paused, remembering the desperate radio calls, the growing casualty count. "I spent 4 hours flying lazy circles, pretending to be a normal patrol while actually hunting that sniper like a hawk looking for mice." The room was absolutely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. "When I finally spotted him, muzzle flash from a spider hole about 1,000 meters from the friendlies, I put one 30mm round through his position from 3 miles out. Perfect shot, no collateral damage, threat eliminated." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The Special Forces captain said I struck like a viper, patient, precise, and absolutely lethal." The silence that followed was different from before, weighted with respect rather than curiosity. The BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, was a converted shipping container with air conditioning that fought a losing battle against the Afghan heat. Viper's room was Spartanly functional. Military-issue cot, metal desk, wall locker containing 3 flight suits and civilian clothes she hadn't worn in months. Personal items were limited to a photograph of her grandfather in his World War II uniform and a well-worn copy of Chuck Yeager's autobiography. She stripped down to a tank top and shorts, trying to fool her body into believing it was cool enough for sleep. Outside, the base hummed with midnight activity, generators, vehicles, the distant sound of helicopters returning from missions she didn't want to think about. Each sound reminded her that war never slept, never paused, never granted mercy to the exhausted or unprepared. The photograph drew her attention like a magnet. Abuelo Ricardo, standing beside his P-51 Mustang somewhere in the Pacific Theater, 1943. He was barely 22 in the picture, younger than she was now, but his eyes held the same mixture of determination and controlled fear that she saw in her own mirror each morning. He'd never talked much about the war, just fragments shared during quiet moments on his New Mexico ranch. Stories about flying through monsoon storms over the Philippines, about friends who didn't come back from missions over Japan, about the weight of survival when others had paid the ultimate price. Now she understood the shadows behind his smiles, the way he'd sometimes stare at the sky like he was seeing ghosts. Her phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. She almost deleted it without reading standard procedure for operational security, but something made her hesitate. The message was simple: "Fly safe, Viper. Marcus would be proud." Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. Nobody should have known about Marcus, about their connection, about the guilt that drove her toward increasingly dangerous missions. The message felt like absolution and condemnation rolled into a single sentence. She tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a disconnected recording. Probably a burner phone, already discarded in some Kabul market. But the words echoed in her mind like prayer, like promise, like prophecy. Sleep came in fragments, brief periods of unconsciousness interrupted by dreams that felt more real than memory. She was flying again, low over hostile terrain, Marcus on her wing. But this time he wasn't crashing into the mountain. This time he was talking to her, voice clear and calm through the radio static. "Stay focused, Viper. Eyes on the target, not on the past. Marcus, is that really you? Does it matter? What matters is tomorrow. Hassan's waiting, and you're the only one who can reach him." "I'm scared." The admission felt like ripping off a bandage. "Good, fear keeps you alive, but don't let it control you." The dream conversation was interrupted by her alarm clock. 400 hours arrived with the persistence of incoming artillery. Viper rolled out of bed instantly, muscle memory, overriding the disorientation of inadequate sleep. 4 hours had passed like 4 minutes, but her body felt rested in the way that only combat pilots understood, not fully recovered, but functional enough for the mission ahead. Her pre-flight routine was ritualistic in its precision. Shower, shave, breakfast, black coffee, and whatever passed for food in the chow hall. Equipment check, weather briefing. Each step performed with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this dance hundreds of times before. The flight line was alive with activity despite the early hour. Maintenance crews made final checks on her A-10. Weapons specialists armed the hardpoints with deadly precision. Fuel trucks topped off tanks that would carry her deep into enemy territory and hopefully back home again.